Hi, and welcome to Mofka's Backyard Composting for the Homestead and Backyard Garden. My name's Dave Colson. I own New Leaf Farm in Durham, Maine. We've been here since 1982. We were certified for organic crops in 1985 and sold commercially until 2014. I also worked for Mofka for about 10 years. And now we're retired and doing a whole lot more homesteading on our farm these days. And one of the things that we have done all these years in various forms, and now do primarily more on a smaller scale, is composting. Now, composting is a natural biological process where organisms break down organic material into usable materials for fertilizing or use in the garden. And that decomposition is recycling those nutrients so they aren't lost in the process. So what we're trying to do in the composting process is to provide an optimum environment for those organisms to grow and break down the compostable materials that we've collected. And we're looking to create a process in a specific location to optimize those conditions. So compost is often thought of as a fertilizer in itself, and it does hold nutrients. Often there's a lot of nutrients in compost, but they're bound up in the compost. So one of the good things about it is it's a very slow release nutrients or fertilizer. And rather than a chemical fertilizer, which is in the form of a salt and is available pretty much instantly and can be lost in the soil through leaching or other situations. So the other thing that compost is really good for is as a soil conditioner, because compost has the ability to absorb and release nutrients. Besides the nutrients that make up the actual compost itself, it has chemical bonds that are on the compost itself that can attract nutrients and hold it to the compost and then release them as that compost breaks down or releases them into the soil moisture so they can be taken up by plants. So often I think of compost more as a soil conditioner than as a nutrient source in itself. It adds texture to the soil, makes it lighter and looser, easier to dig, what we call tilth in the soil, which is the ability to work the soil. To get in there with either equipment or with hand tools, it just creates a lighter, fluffier soil. And increasing that tilth of the soil not only makes it easier to work, but it helps with drainage and it helps with water retention, which is one of the other amazing things about compost, is that it both will help to retain moisture and it will help with drainage. So if you have too wet a summer, having a high enough organic matter amount in the soil can help to drain the water, but then in a dry season, it can also help to hold moisture in the soil itself. So manure or compost also has some benefits over using manure in that its nutrients, as I said, are released more slowly. Manure, the nutrients can be leached or lost to the atmosphere pretty quickly, like in the form of nitrogen. And it can also smell, obviously. Plus, manure can contain pathogens that can either be detrimental to plants or even make humans sick, or weed seeds and other things that can affect the garden once we're utilizing it on the garden. So there's lots of great reasons for using compost and making compost. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about is the garden collection of materials for composting, or the kitchen collection. And what we call a hot compost versus a cold compost. So a hot compost would be supplying all the various pieces that we're going to talk about, the carbon pieces and the nitrogen pieces, and mixing them together so that you create all that food for the microorganisms to work on. And the pile heats up very quickly and begins to decompose very quickly. Now, ideally, heating the compost pile to 131 degrees, which is kind of the number for organic growers that they're looking for to actually have their compost approved for use as compost. Often compost can get above that, 140, even up as high as 150, 160 degrees. And that's when all those materials are mixed together in the correct proportions and really have a chance to heat up. Now, typically in the garden and small farm or homestead, we don't have that resource to have all that material at once. Unless you're doing something like cleaning out the whole garden at once and chopping it all up, or you have manure from bedding from animals or something like that. Generally, we're adding a little bit at a time. And particularly if you're mostly composting your kitchen waste, you're bringing out maybe a small bucket of compost regularly, maybe daily, maybe every couple of days, and dumping it onto the pile. So there's never a chance for that material to really heat up and get cooking. In our case, we do collect our kitchen waste. We have a nice little bucket for that to go into. And what we've cut up and used to make meals with, we dump in the compost bucket, and that goes into the pile. Now, this pile behind me is a finished pile, so I'm not going to dump it on there, but you know, pretty familiar if you're doing any composting with this process. And the trouble with those kitchen waste is they're often really moist. And if you've left that kitchen waste in that bucket for too long a time, you know what that can smell like. So that is a type of anaerobic decomposition, or decomposition without air. And what we want is an aerobic decomposition, is with air. So the microorganisms we're most interested in decompose biological or organic material, carbon material, with the presence, in the presence of air. And so if we're adding the kitchen waste, two things can happen. One is we're not really adding enough material at any one time for it to heat up well. And two, we're often adding enough moisture that the compost is too wet, and it tends towards that anaerobic decomposition. So ideally, what we would do is be able to add other materials into the compost in order to create the correct balance. So often in composting, if you look at books or literature about composting, they'll talk about a carbon to nitrogen ratio. Well, I don't know about you, but for me, I have a pretty good understanding of what carbon is. It's hard to figure out exactly where the nitrogen sources are. Now, nitrogen sources are often typically residues. Often we use animal residues, different kinds of animal manures, and we can also generate those things through plants such as your grass clippings or cutting clovers, things like that. But often the nitrogen is the hardest part to add to the compost pile. But typically what we're looking for is a ratio of about 20 to 1, 15 to 1. Different literature will talk about different ratios. But it's basically a larger amount of carbon and a small amount of nitrogen. And the carbon is what the microorganisms are using to provide energy for their growth, and the nitrogen provides protein building blocks also for growth, but not actually building their bodies. So when we have that kitchen waste that's kind of too wet, often what we want to do is add something dry to it in order to reduce the amount of moisture. So I have a few different sources here that we use for carbon. I like to collect leaves, and in our bin system here, I'll often use one of the bins just to collect leaves in during the fall, and then I can dole those out a little bit at a time as I add the kitchen waste to the compost. Additionally, we can use things like hay. This hay is very dried out. Let's see a little bit of green in there, I guess, but this is just hay that was left over from haying this summer. And one of the difficulties with hay is it isn't necessarily being grown for composting, so it can have weed seeds in here. And one of the problems with a cold compost that we're kind of talking about for the backyard is that it doesn't heat to that temperature to kill weed seeds. So sometimes by using hay or straw, we can actually be bringing weed seed into the compost, which is one of the nice things about using leaves instead. And then finally, I have an old corn stalk here as well. We can use that. It's also very high carbonaceous material, does break down very slowly, kind of hard to use, but I just wanted to point it out. And then additionally, sometimes people use sawdust or wood chips. Those are probably your highest amount of carbon, and in order to break down well, they're really going to need a higher amount of nitrogen in the pile. So now that we've added these carbon materials to our kitchen waste, we've probably thrown off that balance. And that's because kitchen waste is really right around that 1 to 20 carbon to nitrogen, 20 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So once we've added more leaves, now we've added more carbon, and maybe we're not going to break down quite as fast. So that's where adding grass clippings, if you don't have access to bedding or manure, things like that, might be helpful in your pile. Otherwise, it will just take a longer period of time for those things to break down. What we're using here is a 3-bin system, and this allows us to either collect the material, turn the material, or have different materials available depending on how we're doing our composting. Now, today we are collecting our fresh kitchen waste in the bin, and I'm just going to dump this bucket into the bin, and you can kind of see that this is all pretty raw stuff. Hasn't decomposed yet. We're just basically putting it on, and then every once in a while layering in some carbon material into it. Right now in bin 2, we're actually collecting carbon material that we can add in during the growing season. So these are some leaves that we've picked up from the yard, and we're just going to put that onto the pile. And we don't really using this for composting, although leaf mulch and broken down leaves create a really nice seeding mix. But we're just mostly holding that and being able to add it into the pile to help dry it out over the growing season. And then finally, we have a 3rd bin here that we've been leaving. This has been settling for about a year. So we stopped adding new material to this pile, and we're just letting it break down, decompose, and finish composting. One of the nice things of this system, and this is built with the posts and then a piece of wood on the outside, so that these boards can slip down in. So they slip between the post and the board. You add a board in. If we need more height, we can add them in, and obviously we can go pretty high. But then when it's time to turn the pile or access the pile, we can pull the various boards off, and then we have good access. We also have the bin lined in the back with a wire mesh so that it makes it a little harder for critters to get in. Obviously, mice can get through this size of wire, but this will do a pretty good job of keeping skunks and other things out. Now, this pile has been left for a good period of time. It does have some undecomposed material on top, but as I dig down into the pile, it's a pretty good rough compost in there. And we've been getting some freezing temperatures these last few nights, so this is beginning to freeze in here because it's really not cooking much anymore. This has gone through that hot process, and it's what we say maturing at this point, which basically means that it's gone through that process and is not going to damage plants if it's put out into the garden. And ideally, once we pull this out, and in this case, this has been left for an even longer period of time and had some turning, so it's been broken up somewhat. But this is what we should end up with, which is really a nice light product. No real odor to it at all. Smells kind of earthy. You know, just the kind of thing that you want to add to your garden. So there's a couple alternatives to the bin system. Some folks want to set up a composting system that's more temporary. Maybe you're not in a location where you want to have a permanent structure, or not sure where you want to have that compost bin. So a couple of other ways of doing it. One way is to use pallets that you might be able to collect and wire them together into 4 sides and build your compost into that. Another way that I like is I use this 2-inch wire mesh fencing. It's relatively sturdy. It's not the chicken wire. It's a little thicker wire. And this is about a 8-foot piece. And we wrap it around and retie it to itself. In this case, I've also helped hold up the structure with some steel poles. You don't necessarily need those. They're more useful. The poles are more useful when you're starting to fill the bin, so to speak, just to help hold it up until it begins to grow. What's nice about this system is that you can add in your layers, and you can actually, since you can see all around this, you can actually see the layers as they're building. So the kitchen waste, and then leaves, and then some more kitchen waste, and maybe some hay, something like that. So it actually looks kind of cool as you're building it. And then when you're ready to do something with the pile, you undo the wire here at the end, pull the wire off, and you're good to go. You've got a pile that's pretty easy to shovel into a wheelbarrow, and off to the garden you go. So the last piece I want to talk about is managing your compost pile. So you've added your materials in, you've done your layering of the brown and green, the wet and dry. You've created this good environment for the microorganisms to break down. But what if you begin to find that you're having problems? Some things like maybe the pile's not heating up real well, or it's too dry or too wet, or you're getting an odor from it because maybe it's too wet and you've got some anaerobic decomposition going on. The key to dealing with that is turning the pile. It's always turning the pile. So if the pile is too dry, you would turn the pile and add some water. If the pile is too wet, you would turn the pile just to let more air into it, because we want that anaerobic decomposition to go on. If it doesn't really seem like it's heating up, maybe you'd want to turn it and find some higher nitrogen product, like more grass clippings or some manure from some kind of a source. So always turning is your key to repairing the pile. And that's one of the beauties of the 3-bin system. We're using, as I mentioned, the middle bin for collecting carbonaceous material, but we really could start in the first bin, put all our material in there, turn into the second bin, leave that for a while, and then turn that into the third bin. So you're constantly starting kind of a new pile and then having different maturities on the other 2 piles. And I have met some farmers that go beyond the 3-bin and maybe have a 6-bin or 10-bin. So they're doing those multiple turnings. Now, the more turning that you end up doing, the more you're exposing the material to the air and the microorganisms. As long as there's enough moisture, you can speed up that decomposition process. Or you can really fill your bin, layer it in as best you want, and really just leave it there and not necessarily do all the turning. Kind of the lazy person's way of doing it, but also a lot less work. In that kind of system, really it would take about a year for that compost to really break down well. I also want to talk a little bit about composting in a neighborhood or particularly in the city. One of the things that often happens in a compost is critters getting in. We've had everything from skunks to raccoons to seagulls to, we even had a great blue heron this fall that jumped into the pile, and when he was discovered by someone on the farm, was unfortunately kind of hilarious watching this giant bird trying to climb out of our compost bin. So it does attract critters into the pile, and particularly mice and rats in the city or anywhere actually. So a couple of things with that is, one, try and build your bins so that there's some kind of wire mesh or something there so that it's harder for them to get in. 2 is you may want to not utilize animal byproducts, meats, fats, bones, and so on, because as those break down, they can also create enough of an odor that it attracts those critters. All of those are good to decompose and can add nutrients to the pile, but depending on your location, you may want to reconsider using them. And also just again, kind of a plug for composting. It's a great way to kind of recycle nutrients, reuse them in your garden. And if you'd like to have more information about the composting process, a little plug for MOFGA's fact sheets. There's a great fact sheet on backyard and homestead composting. If you go to mofga.org, you can look under publications, and that fact sheet, you'll be able to find that fact sheet and a number of other ones. So thanks for listening, and happy gardening.